Close your eyes and take a deep breath. Today I invite you into a legend where even the gods believed the war was over. Just before the earth itself rose against them, when the Titans fell, Olympus believed itself to be invincible. Zeus ruled the heavens, Poseidon held the seas, and Hades sealed the underworld. The old age of chaos seemed to have ended, and the universe finally appeared to have entered an age of order. But the gods had failed to notice one thing. While they celebrated their victory deep beneath the earth, a mother had not forgotten that her children had been bound in chains. That mother was Gaia. For Gaia, this was not merely a lost war. It meant that her children had been buried in darkness, the old bloodlines had been silenced, and power had once again ruled through fear. So she did not mourn. She waited in silence, patiently. She nurtured the fury growing inside her, so that one day she could turn it into a vengeance that would shake the entire sky. And as that silence stretched on, the world began to change. The mountains groaned, the seas swelled. Deep beneath the earth, the ground began to tremble. At first, Olympus took these as ordinary signs, but the truth was far more terrifying. Gaia was bringing forth a new race for vengeance, giants whose bodies ended in serpentine forms below the knees, giants powerful enough to tear mountains from the earth and hurl them toward the sky, the Gigantes. They had not been born merely to wage war, but to shatter the order that Olympus had believed could never fall. And so the War of Gigantomachy began. This was not only a war between gods and giants. It was the return of buried fury. It was proof that everything forced beneath the surface would one day rise again. Olympus would understand that far too late, because the rage growing beneath the earth no longer wished to remain hidden. It wanted to rise and march against the heavens. Before we begin this epic, I have a small request that means a lot to me. Please don't forget to subscribe to my channel. The greatest reward for all the effort I put into creating these epics is your support through subscribing to my channel. If you enjoy my content and want me to continue creating more, your subscription and like truly give me great motivation. Also, don't forget to share your thoughts with me in the comments. Your comments not only encourage me, but also help me understand what kind of epics and stories you would like to see on this channel. Thank you so much in advance for your support. Take a deep breath, relax your mind, and let the rhythm of this ancient legend guide you. Wishing you a peaceful sleep. The epic of the war even Zeus could not stop Gigantomachy begins now. It had all begun before the sky had even been given a name. First there had been endless emptiness, then darkness, and then the first great foundation from which all forms would emerge, Gaia. She had not merely been ground to walk upon. She had been the bearer of mountains, rivers, forests, wind, and every war that would one day be fought. When she brought forth the star-filled sky from within herself, Uranus, the universe was divided into above and below for the first time, and the uncertainty of creation began to resemble order. But that order had been marked by fear in its very first generation. Uranus had recoiled from the raw power carried by his newborn children, and he had buried the 100-handers and the Cyclopes deep in darkness, preventing them from rising into the light. And so the first sin of power had been committed. The strong had feared what would come after them, and had locked that fear beneath the earth. For Gaia, this had not been only the loss of her children, it had been the first great wound opened within her own body. No matter where her children were chained, their suffering still echoed in her depths. In that way, The quiet anger of Mother Earth had begun to take shape in the earliest ages of the universe. Gaia had not forgotten Uranus's cruelty. She had been a being who understood patience. She had transformed her anger not into a fire that flared up at once, but into a decision slowly sharpened over time. She had drawn a sharp sickle of adamant from the depths of the earth and called the Titans. This line had seemed more ordered, more conscious, and more inclined toward ambition for power than their other siblings. Kronos, the youngest among them, had accepted his mother's offer. As the darkness of night closed over Gaia, he had emerged from hiding and brought down his father. When the trace of Uranus's wounding had fallen upon the earth, the universe had gained not only a new ruler, but also a new curse. For while one generation had seemed to end the cruelty of the one before it, it had in fact begun another link in the same cycle. Kronos had taken the throne, but with the throne, he had also inherited fear. Just as Uranus had feared his own children, Kronos had come to believe that one day one of his own descendants would overthrow him. So the language of power had not changed, only the speaker had. For Gaia, that had been the most painful truth of all. The tyrant fell, but the logic of tyranny kept living on. Over time, Kronos' fear had come to mirror his father's. The 100-handers and the Cyclopes had been shut away in darkness once again. Then the prophecy had come. One day his own son would overthrow him. Those words had poisoned Kronos' spirit. As Rhea, his sister, bore him children, he swallowed them the moment they were born. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon had been sealed inside the invisible prison of their father's body. To avoid losing her last child, Rhea had turned to Gaia for help and secretly brought Zeus into the world on Crete. She had handed Kronos a swaddled stone in the baby's place. When Zeus had grown, he had returned as another generation, carrying his mother's patience and Gaia's ancient anger. With the help of Metis, a drink was prepared and given to Kronos, and the swallowed siblings were brought back into the light. Then, the Gigantomachy began. It was not merely a family struggle for a throne. It was the cosmic war between the old order and the new. Even so, what truly changed the war was not brute force, but the release of what had been suppressed. Guided by Gaia, Zeus freed the 100-handers and the Cyclopes. The Cyclopes gave him the thunderbolt, Poseidon the trident, and Hades the helm of invisibility. In that way, those who had been locked in darkness became decisive in the founding of the new order. Zeus won the Gigantomachy after 11 years of war. Kronos and the Titans were chained in Tartarus, Olympus rose, the sky was given to Zeus, the sea to Poseidon, and the underworld to Hades. From the outside, it seemed as if chaos had ended and justice had been established. But for Gaia, appearance and truth were not the same. Her children had once again been shut beneath the earth. Yes, the Titans had lost the war, but the issue had not been their defeat. It had been their being buried in darkness once again. Uranus had hidden his children, Kronos had swallowed his own line, and now Zeus had sealed his rivals in Tartarus. The holders of power kept changing, but the tradition of burying the feared bloodline beneath the earth did not. At that point, Gaia saw the same old fear beneath the brilliance of order. While songs of victory rose on Olympus, Mother Earth still felt the cries of her children in her own body. For the gods, this had been a new beginning. For Gaia, it had been an old crime repeated under another name. That was why her silence had not been surrender. Silence could sometimes be the first form of the longest revenge. In the depths of the earth, a new decision began to take shape. As Zeus and his siblings set about ruling the world, the surface of order truly did grow stronger. The seas were restrained, the sky settled into its own laws, and the gates of the underworld were sealed. But every law established above the earth deepened the suppressed pain below it. Gaia was not only the mother who carried the earth, she was a memory that did not forget. She did not forget Uranus's blood, Kronos's greedy fear, the sound of the Titan's chains, or the closing gates of Tartarus. In her eyes, the order of Olympus stood not through justice, but through the power to suppress. And that meant one thing. One day, everything that had been suppressed would return. The anger growing inside Mother Earth did not spread like a sudden explosion, but like magma building layer by layer. It moved into mountains, the patience of stone, the depths of the seas, and invisible fault lines. Those living on the earth did not yet know it, but the new order of the universe had created its own crack, even as it was being established. Because no throne guarded by fear could remain unshaken forever. The day would come when Olympus would face a threat not from the place nearest the sky, but from the deepest reaches of the earth. That was why the true beginning of the Gigantomachy had not been the moment the giants first rose to the surface, but the moment the Titanomachy ended. The victory seen on the battlefield had become the seed of an unseen defeat. As Zeus rose toward the sky, Gaia looked downward. While Olympus believed itself master of order, the earth itself felt how fragile that order truly was. Every new ruler who locked children beneath the ground opened a new wound in Gaia's heart and turned that wound into a new form of vengeance. And so the oldest truth of the universe emerged once again. What was suppressed did not vanish. It only changed form. The Titans may have fallen, but another anger that would rise after them had already begun to take shape. And this time that anger would not march against individual crowns, but against the order itself. The great fracture inside Gaia deepened, not so much because her children had been defeated, but because they had once again been shut away in darkness. She understood the language of war. One bloodline rose and another fell. She could have accepted that. What she could not accept was that every power others feared was always sent to the same place, beneath the earth, into silence, into chains. Uranus had done it. Cronus had done it too. Now Zeus had chosen the same path. To Mother Earth only the names had changed. In every age, power had hidden what it feared in order to protect itself. That was why her anger stopped being the ordinary grief of a mother and turned into a conscious hatred for a crime that history kept repeating. When the Titans were shut away in Tartarus, Gaia felt not only the cries of her children, but the humiliation of creation itself. To her, fertility meant that new life and new power were meant to rise to the surface. Olympus, however, suppressed what was born, sealed away what had grown, and buried in darkness whatever was stronger or simply different. It was there that revenge took shape. This time, something would have to rise against them. That was too deeply rooted to suppress and too closely bound to the earth to be torn away. Gaia did not think of revenge as a single cry of outrage, but as a long act of creation. Impatient anger could be overcome easily, but anger that had matured like stone could shift the world from its foundations. While Olympus secured itself above, Gaia measured everything in the depths below. She bound together the strength of the Titans, the trace of Uranus, every silenced cry beneath the earth, and the pain of her motherhood into one purpose. This time, the bloodline she would create would not merely be powerful, it would also be directly joined to the earth itself. Even if a god wounded one of them, the ground beneath it would continue feeding its strength. Her new children would lean not toward the sky, but toward rock and soil. In that way, what would rise against Olympus would not be merely an army, but the world itself in its fighting form. Gaia's silence was no longer only the silence of mourning. It was growing heavier with the low murmur of new bodies and new destinies taking shape within it. Beneath the mountains, a movement no eye had yet seen had begun, and through the veins of the earth, a slow but irreversible heat had started to spread. When the first signs became visible, no one could explain them. Meaningless rumblings rose from inside certain mountains. The swelling of the seas grew violent for no reason, and on some nights, the tremors beneath the ground drove animals into panic. Those who lived along the coasts noticed that the rhythm of the water had changed, and those who stood on high cliffs felt that the wind was carrying some unseen weight as it shifted direction. Yet none of this was called disaster, at least not yet. The mind has a habit of mistaking great destruction, while it is still approaching, for ordinary disorder. Olympus did the same. Zeus saw these things as temporary disturbances in nature. Poseidon dismissed the sea's temper as a passing unrest. Hades took note of the distortion in the echoes below, but even he could not yet give it a true name. In truth, all of these signs were tied to a single source. Gaia was now spreading her pain into the structure of the world itself, preparing every layer of the earth for a new birth. Every tremor, every swelling tide, every deep rumble was a sign. The revenge of the bloodlines that had been forced below was drawing near. As Gaia's answer became clearer in her mind, the idea of revenge slowly took form. This time she would not simply set one son against another, nor would she try to change thrones with a single blow. She would bring forth a new bloodline that would stand directly against Olympus. The Titans had been the children of the old order. Those yet to be born would be the embodied return of everything that had been suppressed. So while stone and fire prepared for a new birth in the deep places of the earth, Gaia also determined what her children would be. They would be giants, bound to the ground with serpent bodies from the waist down, shoulders as broad as rocky cliffs, and strength great enough to tear mountains from their places. These beings were not being created for size alone. Each of them would be the dark answer of the earth to the pride of Olympus, which leaned on the sky. Gaia was no longer only a suffering mother. She had become a will that turned pain into strategy. What she was building beneath the earth was not just a bloodline, but a military answer. For the first time, Olympus continued on without realizing that the very world it ruled might one day become its enemy. Mother Earth's deepest wound was not simply that she had lost her children, but that they had been silenced every time. That was why the first trait of the bloodline to come had to be that it could not be silenced. Gaia placed not only strength into the bodies of her children, but the memory of anger as well. They would not be soldiers who learned later why they fought. They would be born with purpose, the sound of the Titan's chains, the order of fear that had endured since Uranus, and the darkness of Tartarus would run through their veins not as story, but as instinct. And so, when they rose to the surface one day, they would not be merely attacking monsters, but the walking bodies of a history that had been forced underground. That was what Gaia wanted. Olympus considered itself the home of order. The new bloodline would bring back the buried sins beneath that order. For that reason, what was coming was not merely revenge. It was the final confrontation between order and suppressed memory. The rumbling spreading through the world grew stronger. The mountains groaned for longer. The sea swelled more violently without cause. And beneath Olympus, an army still unseen had begun to breathe. The spirit of the Gigantomachy was born there. The giants had not yet stepped into daylight, but the war had already begun. Because sometimes war begins not when the first blow is struck, but when the first injustice is not forgotten. Gaia did not forget. Every time the gates of Tartarus closed, a new decision sharpened inside her. Her children had been imprisoned, and she would show Olympus that everything buried beneath the earth could one day return. The seed of every disaster that followed lay in that feeling. Not defeat, but suppression. Not loss, but humiliation. Not silence, but the promise of returning one day with a far greater voice. In Gaia's eyes, the war had not ended at all. In truth, it had only just begun to take its real shape. After Gaia made her decision, the deep places of the world began to strain as if they were preparing for a heavy birth. This birth was not fed by the warmth of living flesh, but by the hardness of stone and the suffocating breath of underground fire. At night, the insides of certain mountains filled with unexplained crimson light, and by morning, fresh fissures had opened in certain valleys. The mineral veins beneath the earth seemed as if they were being shaped by unseen hands, and the rocks first split apart, then fused together again into strange, enormous forms. This time, Gaia was bringing forth not only children from her own body, but an entire war-born lineage. And every member of that lineage would carry the will of her vengeance. Even though the first forming bodies looked like immense statues lying motionless in the dark, the force burning inside them carried not an ordinary life, but the full fury of ages that had been suppressed. The Earth Mother was creating them not merely for size, but so they would be deeply rooted enough to answer the height Olympus believed could never be reached. Because the strongest answer to the sky always came from the earth itself. The newly born lineage was later known as the Gigantes, the earthborn ones. At first glance, their forms resembled human beings, but their scale was far too vast for either mortals or gods. Their shoulders were as broad as rocky ridges, and their arms were as thick and heavy as the trunks of ancient trees. But their most unsettling feature was that, from the knees down, many of them ended in serpent bodies. That detail was not only a terrifying appearance, it was a sign of who they truly were. The Gigantes were not warriors cut off from the ground. When they moved, they did not crush the earth beneath them. They drew strength from it. Each time their scaled lower bodies coiled and shifted, their bond with Gaia became visible. For them, the ground was not merely a battlefield, it was their mother's breath. That was why, even if a god's blade struck them, the earth beneath their feet could restore their resistance. This was Gaia's great answer. She had set before Olympus not only a powerful army, but an army rooted in the world itself. The battlefield was no longer neutral. The earth itself would stand beside this new race. Gaia did not release her children at random. Each one carried a particular power, and a particular purpose. One of the most imposing among them was Porphyrion. In his body, there was not only brute force, but a claim to leadership. His rage was not aimless. It was focused enough to set its sights on the throne of Olympus. Alcyoneus was frightening in a different way. As long as he remained on the land where he had been born, he was said to be strong enough to rise again even after he had been brought down. Enceladus suggested upheaval and disaster with the very way he moved. The fury of Polybotes was vast enough to spill all the way to the seas. Pallas was the rawest form of primal, blind force. After them came Ephialtes, Hippolytus, Agrius, Thoas, Gratian, and many others rising through the cracks of the earth. Gaia was not acting like a mother who trusted only in numbers. She gave each of her children a direction, a domain, and a symbolic role. In that way, the Gigantes did not become a wandering horde of monsters, but a fractured yet deadly army prepared for the different fronts of Olympus. The world felt this birth before the war itself began. The rumblings inside the mountains grew louder, the courses of the rivers became unstable, and those who lived along the coasts saw the sea withdraw for no reason and then return in anger. The direction of the wind became uncertain in places. Flocks of birds were thrown into strange new routes, and on certain nights the smoke from sacrificial fires sank toward the ground instead of rising into the sky. Mortals and the lesser divine beings took these signs as omens, though they could not yet name them. Yet all of it was the outward expression of a single truth. The world was raising an army within itself. Harsh and stony regions like Phlegra and Pallene became gathering grounds for the new race. The Gigantes did not merely wait there. They turned the nature around them into weapons. Great pieces of rock were torn from mountains, trees were ripped up with their roots, and underground fire was folded into the machinery of destruction. The earth was no longer only the surface that nourished living things. It had become an armory driving its own children into war. The greatest inheritance Gaia gave her children was not strength alone, it was memory. The chains of the Titans echoing in the darkness, the long tradition of suppression that had stretched from Uranus onward, and the pride of Olympus looking down from above, were all imprinted in the minds of the Gigantes from the moment they were born. That was why their rage was not learned. It was something they carried from birth. When they looked at the sky, they did not see holiness there, but a right that had been taken from them. They did not view Olympus as the home of the gods, but as a seat of power built at the expense of the earth's children. That was what set them apart from ordinary aggressors. The Gigantes did not want only to tear things down. They wanted to erase the distance between earth and sky. The idea of piling mountains on top of one another in order to reach Olympus was born from that desire. If the power of the gods came from height, then that height had to be turned into a staircase. In that way, the conflict ceased to be a mere struggle for a throne and became an attempt to overturn the hierarchy of the cosmos itself. When the Gigantes rose to the surface, the world seemed to hold its breath for a moment. The first bodies emerged slowly from the darkness into daylight, first the shoulders, then the massive heads, then the serpent forms. Their movement did not resemble an ordinary march. It was as if the earth itself had split open and stood upright. The wind stopped. The sea pulled back its voice. The birds fell silent. This silence was not the silence of awe, but the silence of cosmic fear. For the first time, creation was bringing back, in a body of such overwhelming scale, something it had once buried within itself. Even if Olympus did not yet fully understand it, What was coming against it was not a foreign army attacking from outside, but the answer of the very world it ruled over. That was how the Gigantes were born, not as the remains of a defeated race, but as the embodied vengeance of everything that had been forced down and held beneath the surface. At first, Olympus misread the signs. The swelling seas, the trembling rocks, and the lengthening shadows seemed like ordinary disturbances to the gods. Zeus treated the small disruptions in the flow of the sky as temporary. Poseidon interpreted the unrest in the deep currents as nothing more than the sea's bad temper. Even Hades, though he noticed that the echoes below the earth had grown heavier, did not yet say that they had become a universal disaster. But as the signs multiplied, they began to fit together as if they were all coming from the same source. The rumblings no longer felt accidental. Cracks opened in places with the same rhythm. In certain regions, the seas pulled back for no clear reason, and then came rushing back with tremendous force. For the first time, Olympus's confidence was shaken in a way no one could see. The gods had never seriously considered that the very world beneath their feet could turn against them. Ruling the heavens was one thing. The earth rising with a will of its own was an entirely different danger. That was where fear was born. The enemy was not an outsider, but the world itself. When the council of the gods gathered, a heavy tension filled the hall. Ares wanted to strike at once. In his eyes, the problem had to be crushed before it grew any larger. Poseidon explained that the seas had fallen out of balance, that this was not merely a murmur before war, but a deliberate pressure rising from beneath the earth. Hades said that the tremors in the passages below had increased beyond anything that could reasonably be explained. Apollo noted that the signs in the sky had begun to unravel, that even light itself seemed to be losing its order. Athena spoke more plainly than any of them. In her judgment, what stood before them was not a natural surge, but a deliberate preparation. Gaia had not forgotten her children. Now the gods needed to see that her unforgotten grief had begun to take form. As her words echoed through the council, Olympus felt the name of the danger for the first time. The danger was not strength alone. The danger was the Earth's conscious anger, and the fact that this anger had given birth to a new race. In that moment, the Gigantes were acknowledged by the gods for the first time, even before they had been fully confronted face to face. When the gods looked down from above, they began to make out the terrifying forms gathering around Phlegra and Pallene. At first glance, they looked like strange movements among the rocks, but little by little their shapes became clear. Serpentine lower bodies coiled between the stones. Enormous shoulders cast shadows across the mountain slopes, and uprooted trees and massive boulders were being carried like weapons. In the face of that sight, Olympus felt not only threatened but diminished. Until then, attacks had always come from weaker beings trying to rise toward the heavens. Now the earth itself was marching upward. And this march was not blind. The intention was obvious: to stack mountains on top of one another, turn height into a staircase, and besiege Olympus within its own domain. For the first time, the gods realized that sacred distance was not the same thing as safety. The Gigantes had been born to erase the very idea of height as protection. In that moment, Zeus understood that this war would not end the way the Gigantomachy had ended, with the defeat of a powerful enemy alone. The very reason cosmic order deserved to exist would have to be proven all over again. Even so, the panic in Olympus did not remain a scattered fear. Within the council, Athena stressed that this war could not be solved by raw force alone, and that the nature of the enemy had to be understood. The Gigantes were bound to the earth, which meant the battlefield itself would work in their favor. Each of them also carried a different quality. Some embodied leadership, some endurance, some speed, and some the presence of catastrophe itself. For that reason, the gods openly accepted for the first time that this war would not be won through a single great clash, but through separate and conditional duels. Yet while those preparations were taking shape, another darker thought moved through the council. If Gaia was acting with this much intention, then deeper forces than strength alone were involved, forces such as prophecy and fate. Here, Olympus felt a lack it could not yet fully name. It was as if the power they possessed was great, but still required another link to complete it. That thought unsettled everyone, because the gods had begun to sense that they might not be enough on their own. As the signs grew heavier, the complacency of Olympus disappeared completely. The celebrations were cut short, weapons were examined, and new preparations began in the workshops of Hephaestus. Yet the question hanging over all of it remained unanswered. How were Gaia's children truly supposed to be stopped? Zeus trusted his lightning, but even he knew that lightning would not solve everything. Poseidon could raise the seas, Athena could build the strategy, Ares could throw himself into battle. Still, all of them felt the strange advantage created by the enemy's direct bond with the earth itself. This was no ordinary war. The enemy now had a route that could retreat deeper and draw strength again whenever it was driven back. When the enemy was the Earth Mother herself, victory was determined not only by the blow you struck, but by where you struck it. It was at that point that Olympus saw its own fragility for the first time. That was the second threshold of the Gigantomachy. Gaia had brought forth her army, and Olympus had finally understood that this was no ordinary rebellion. Now both sides could see one another, but neither side yet knew the true weakness of the other. That uncertainty created a tension heavier even than the open violence of war. For the first time, the gods had begun to ask not only whether their strength would be enough, but what fate itself required of them. The answer would come very soon, but when it came, it would wound the pride of Olympus at the same time. The weight of the prophecy did not settle over Olympus slowly. It fell all at once. In the quietest moment of the council, an old truth was remembered. The giants could not be fully defeated by the hands of the gods alone. They could be wounded, brought down, and driven back. But for their end to be completed, the intervention of a mortal would be required. Those words echoed through the hall like ice. To say that the gods might be incomplete was one of the harshest blows ever struck against the pride of Olympus. Zeus was the lord of lightning. Poseidon could stir the seas with a single surge of fury. Athena was the sharpest face of wisdom and war. And yet, even so, fate was leaving the final completion of victory in mortal hands. When Hera reminded them of the prophecy, every gaze in the chamber turned, almost against its own will, toward the same name, Heracles, the one clad in a lion's skin. But before that name was even fully spoken, another fear arose. If the gods knew of this condition, then Gaia must have known it as well. And if Gaia knew it, then she must already have taken steps to protect her children against that weakness. Athena took that possibility seriously at once. From the very beginning, she had argued that Gaia's anger was not blind, and that she was moving through every link in the war with careful thought. Because of that, the new fear took shape quickly. Gaia was searching for a magic herb that could shield the giants from mortal intervention. If that herb were found and bound to the strength of the giants, the path of the prophecy could be closed, and even if Heracles came, the victory might never be completed. The first great wave of strategic panic in Olympus rose at that exact moment. The issue was no longer simply fighting the enemy. It was protecting the condition that made the war's destined outcome possible. Zeus understood that he could not wait. Before the open war began, he had to make a move on an unseen front. Because sometimes a war was won not by the blows struck on the battlefield, but by the quieter preparations that determined whether those blows would matter at all. For that reason, Zeus chose an unusual method. He commanded Helios, Selene, and Eos to conceal their light. For a brief time, the natural flow of the heavens was broken, and the world was covered in a strange darkness, as though the boundary between day and night had shifted out of place. This was not only a visible dimming, even the rhythm of time itself seemed to hesitate for a moment. People could not understand what was happening. Animals lost their sense of direction, and smaller divine beings hid themselves in fear. But Zeus's purpose was clear. He meant to act before Gaia did. Under the cover of that prolonged darkness, he searched the deep places of the world for the hidden magic herb himself. With the light extinguished, the place where the herb lay became easier to discern, while the paths Gaia might have used to reach it grew temporarily uncertain. In the end, Zeus found the herb and seized it before Gaia could do the same. And so the first great advantage of the war was won before swords clashed and before lightning met the battlefield. Although that event brought a measure of relief to Olympus, it was not complete relief. The gods now knew two truths at once. First, the prophecy was truly binding. Second, Gaia was wise and dangerous enough to try to break it. Zeus's seizure of the magic herb had only kept the way open. It had not guaranteed victory. In fact, it had done the opposite. There was no turning back now. If Heracles was not summoned, the small strategic advantage they seemed to have gained would be wasted. Athena therefore spoke in the council without delay. In her view, the missing link in the war could no longer be postponed. The mortal who would set the prophecy into motion had to be found, and this new age, one in which Olympus acted not out of pride but out of reality, had to begin at once. Zeus accepted that. That acceptance weighed on him heavily, not only as a ruler, but also as a father, because the mortal fate required was his own son. The revelation of the prophecy changed the spirit of Olympus. The gods no longer behaved only as powers ruling from above, but as forces learning the limits of their own reach. This did not diminish them. On the contrary, it forced them to see the true face of the war. From that moment on, the Gigantomachy would no longer be only a clash between gods and giants. Fate, strategy, and mortal courage would all become part of it. Zeus's act of darkening the light and securing the herb became the first quiet victory of the Great War. But the meaning of that victory was this. Olympus now knew that it could not wage the war alone, and it was no longer hiding that truth. What remained now was to find the one who would fill that void. Gaia, however, did not stop because of this move, though for the first time she saw that the other side was as watchful as she was. She had lost the herb, yes, but her children still carried the strength of the earth, and the war had not yet begun. Olympus, for its part, found no peace even after seizing the herb, because now every eye had turned toward the same point. The fate of Olympus was shifting toward the shoulders of a mortal clad in a lion's skin. When Athena descended to the mortal world, the world was no longer the world it had once been. Dust clouds drifted along the mountain slopes, the breath of the sea had gone uneasy along certain shores, and the heavy tremors moving beneath the earth filled people with a fear they could not explain. As the goddess looked over that scene, she understood once again that the Gigantomachy was not only a matter for Olympus. If Gaia's children were not stopped, it would not be only the palace of the gods that would fall, but also the cities, harbors, temples, roads, and the whole rhythm of human life. For that reason, her descent to Earth was not an ordinary mission of invitation, but a mission to find the one person who would complete the missing link in fate. The one she sought had already become half legend and half reality through his fame. With a lion's skin over his shoulders, a club in his hand, a bow across his back, and the marks of countless trials carried in his body, Heracles stood there as the man who had borne the heaviest burdens on earth. The moment Athena saw him, she understood without hesitation why the prophecy pointed to this name. He was both mortal and born from divine blood. He could suffer, and yet he could go beyond the limits of ordinary human strength. When Heracles saw the goddess, he did not react with fear. His life had already been shaped by divine interventions and impossible tasks. Even so, the seriousness on Athena's face made it clear that this summons was different from the others. The goddess did not speak in circles. Olympus was on the verge of being surrounded. Gaia had brought forth a new race for revenge. The giants had become terrifying not only because of their strength, but because the earth itself stood with them. And this was the hardest truth of all. The gods would not be able to bring them down completely on their own. The prophecy required that the final blow be delivered by a mortal hand. Those words settled onto Heracles' shoulders like an invisible weight. What stood before him now was not a single monster or a single task. It was a cosmic war that would shake the sky, the sea, the earth, and the underworld all at once. And when Athena told him that they were not merely asking for his help, but that this war could not truly be brought to an end without him, Heracles understood that this summons was not only an honor, but a burden of fate. Heracles' answer was not dramatic. He did not treat the call to stand with the gods as some exalted reward, but as the inevitable continuation of the path his life had already taken. He had always stood between two worlds. On one side, he was mortal. He could be wounded, he could grow tired, he could suffer, and he carried the limits of the human body. On the other side, as the son of Zeus, he bore a divine origin and had gone far beyond ordinary men through what he had achieved. That was exactly why the prophecy had chosen him. He was a living bridge between heaven and earth. When Athena saw in his eyes not fear, but the acceptance of a burden, she finished speaking without hardening her tone. He would not be in this war for glory, but for the outcome. Each giant would require a different method, a different moment, and a different kind of cooperation. When Heracles heard this, he understood that this time he would not simply perform solitary acts of heroism, he would become a living part of the god's design. That made the task not lighter, but heavier. As he turned toward Olympus with Athena, Heracles' journey was not only a physical ascent. He was leaving the scale of mortal life behind and stepping into the heart of cosmic history. The mountains fell away behind him, the heavens drew nearer, the world below seemed to shrink, and the measure of human life slowly began to blend with the measure of the divine. Even so, Heracles did not forget his mortality during that ascent. On the contrary, he knew that the very thing this war demanded from him was that mortality itself. Olympus's missing element was his human finitude. The gods might stretch toward eternity, but the final seal required a hand that carried the truth of life's limit. During that quiet journey, Athena gave him his first knowledge of Alcyoneus, Porphyrion, and the other giants. Some were bound to the earth, some had been blinded by ambition, and some could only be brought down at exactly the right moment. The more Heracles listened, the clearer the stark scale of the war became. This was not a disaster that could be overcome through a single display of bravery. It would have to be won step by step and through careful judgment at every stage. When he arrived on Olympus, he was not met with applause but with the weight of preparation. That, more than anything, showed why Heracles' summons had not been ordinary. The gods had called him not to a feast, but to war. When Zeus looked at his son, there was none of the softness of fatherhood in his gaze, only the gravity of rule. What was being acknowledged now was that Olympus needed a mortal in order to secure victory. But Heracles did not shrink beneath that gaze. He knew where fate had called him, yet before he had even struck the first great blow, he was still weighing his role within it. Olympus had called him upward. Now the distance between heaven and earth would be closed in his hands. Athena had completed her task. The prophecy had ceased to be abstract knowledge and had taken on flesh and bone. Now the question was whether that union would truly work when tested on the field of war. With the coming of Heracles, the spirit of Olympus changed. The earlier feeling of shame slowly gave way to a hard, sober realism. The gods had now completed their missing link. That did not make the war easier, but it made the war possible. Gaia's children were still gathering strength in Phlegra, still turning mountains and stones into weapons, still preparing to make a staircase out of Olympus's height. But now they were no longer facing the gods alone. They were facing a hero who represented the heaviest courage of mortality itself. It was here that the true language of the Gigantomachy was established. Divine power would open the way, and a mortal hand would close it. With Heracles' arrival on Olympus, the War Council gathered again, and this time the discussion centered not on general fears, but on concrete targets. Athena said clearly that the giants could not be treated as a single mass. Each giant could be overcome under different conditions. For that reason, the first great clash of the war had to begin with a duel that would test both the heart of the enemy and the logic behind it. The first name chosen was Alcyoneus. That was because he was not only one of the largest and most fearsome of the giants. It was said that as long as he remained bound to the land where he had been born, he could regain his strength even after being brought down. That made him not an ordinary warrior, but something close to a moving fortress. If Alcyoneus remained unbeatable in his own domain, the giant's morale would rise, and Olympus's confidence would be shaken at the very start of the war. That was why the goal of the first clash was both military and symbolic, to shatter the idea of invincibility. Athena explained the nature of Alcyoneus in detail. His strength did not lie only in his muscles. It lay in the unseen bond he had formed with the ground beneath his feet. The place where he stood fed power back into him like one of Gaia's great veins. Because of that, Heracles' task could not simply be to bring the giant down. He had to draw him beyond the region where he had been born. That is, sever him from the Earth's primary support. Here, Heracles learned the first great lesson of the war. The Gigantomachy was not a war that would be won merely by the one who struck the hardest. It required knowing what sustained the enemy, what allowed him to rise again, and when he could truly be left alone. Zeus could open the field with his lightning, and Athena could create the plan, but it would still be Heracles who gave that plan physical form. In that way, the hero's role became clear. He would not be only the one who delivered the final blow, but the hand that carried out the divine design in decisive form. In Hephaestus's workshops, preparations began for this new role. Heracles' bow was inspected, his club was tested, and the penetrating force of his fate-shaping Hydra arrows was calculated once again. That was because the giant's thick hides and the strange resilience rising from the earth might not be pierced by ordinary weapons. For the first time, Olympus seemed less like a single palace and more like a vast engine of war. Hephaestus searched for answers in metal. Athena calculated the openings in the enemy's nature. Zeus issued the overall command, and Heracles prepared in silence at the center of all that divine intelligence. His preparation was not showy. He did not boast about himself, he did not dream aloud of victory, and he did nothing except commit what he had learned to memory. That was what set him apart from other heroes. He faced victory not with excitement, but by carrying the full seriousness of the burden. And perhaps that was exactly why he was truly worthy of being the one the prophecy had chosen. The battle plan was laid out in detail. The first strike would not appear to be an open challenge. Alcyoneus would first be measured, his rhythm would be understood, and it would be determined at what moment he leaned most heavily into the earth. If he was attacked too early, the giant would simply be brought down and rise again. If he could be drawn out with patience, his anger might carry him beyond the borders of his own region. At this point, Athena told Heracles that he would need to use not only strength but patience as well. That advice expressed the essence of the war. In the Gigantomachy, victory sometimes came not from rushing forward, but from drawing the enemy toward the line of his own end. When Heracles accepted this plan, he felt that he had fully moved beyond solitary heroism. He was now part of a war order that functioned together with the gods. That did not diminish him. On the contrary, it placed his actions inside a larger meaning. A heavy silence settled over Olympus before the battle. Everyone knew the importance of the first duel. If Alcyoneus fell, it would prove that the prophecy truly worked, and the giants' belief in their own unshakable strength would be broken. If he did not fall, the giants would advance against Olympus with even greater confidence. When Zeus looked at his son, he felt for the first time that the outcome of the war rested not only in his lightning, but on Heracles' shoulders as well. Heracles, meanwhile, was looking not at the sky, but at the earth. That was because the first enemy before him drew his strength not from above, but from the ground. Even that single glance summed up the logic of the war. For the first time, the fate of Olympus had become so deeply tied to the patience and sense of direction of a mortal. And so the stage of preparation was complete. Athena had fulfilled her summons, Zeus had opened the way required by the prophecy, and Olympus had found its missing link. Now theory would end, and the power of the giants would be tested in the field. The first target was clear, the plan was clear, and the condition was clear. Alcyoneus had to fall, but not merely by being struck. He had to be uprooted. Because in this war, every victory had to overcome not only the body, but also the law that stood behind the body. The first true clash of the war opened on the stony, unforgiving ground of Phlegra. Even the air felt different there. The wind carried dust from the rocks, and a muffled rumble rose from beneath the earth. Alcyoneus stood out at once among the other giants on the battlefield. It was not only because of his size. Around him, the ground beneath his feet seemed denser, more alive, and more resolute. With every step he took, the land answered him, as if the earth was not merely bearing his weight, but also feeding him some hidden strength. When Heracles first saw him, he understood even more clearly how right Athena's warning had been. The enemy before him was not simply a body of muscle and bone. He was a catastrophe fused with his own native ground. Zeus split the front line with a bolt of lightning. Athena marked the directions, and the clash began. The opening blows felt as if heaven and earth were colliding in full view for the first time. Rocks flew upward, the giant's roar shook the heart of the ground, and Heracles searched patiently for its rhythm. The most frightening thing about Alcyoneus was that despite his massive size, he moved with startling agility. His serpent-like lower body did not make him merely heavy and slow. Instead, it let him glide over the ground and shift direction in an instant. With his enormous hands, he hurled boulders he had torn free, then raised his body like a tower and brought down crushing strikes. In those first exchanges, Heracles did not unleash all of his strength at once. He met some blows with his club, slipped past some of the stones at the last moment, and at other times stepped back to read the enemy's movements. His first goal was not victory, but knowledge. He needed to understand where Alcyoneus set the full weight of his body when he leaned more deeply into the earth, and how far his fury would drive him in pursuit. The duel therefore became not only a test of courage, but a test of patience. For the first time, the true logic of the Gigantomachy revealed itself on the field. To defeat the enemy, one first had to understand him. At last, Heracles saw his chance and gathered the full weight of his body into a single blow. His club came down so hard across the giant's shoulder line that even the surrounding rocks shuddered with the echo. For a moment, Alcyoneus was thrown backward, his vast body reeled, and he collapsed to the ground. On the side of Olympus, the sight sparked a brief surge of hope. For the first time, such a great giant had been brought down. But that hope did not last. After lying still for only a few breaths, Alcyoneus began to stir again, as though the ground beneath him were pressing him upward from within. His fingers gripped the rocks, his shoulders rose, and his body lifted upright once more. Athena's warning had come true exactly as she had said. In that moment, Heracles understood completely that the problem was not a lack of strength. He was not fighting the giant alone. He was fighting the law of the earth itself. As long as Alcyoneus remained within his own land, even falling to the ground did not bring him to the final edge of defeat. And so the duel moved into a new phase. The issue was no longer striking him, but drawing him out. From that moment on, Heracles changed his tactic. Instead of charging Alcyoneus head-on, he provoked him. At times he fired an arrow and then withdrew. At times he stood openly in the giant's line of sight, challenging his pride. Alcyoneus could not ignore such a challenge, especially after Heracles had already thrown him to the ground once. The sight of the hero still standing firm only sharpened the giant's rage. So he gathered all of his weight and thundered after him. This was the moment Athena had been waiting for. As Heracles continued to retreat, the line of the battle slowly moved beyond the boundaries of the land where Alcyoneus had been born. Zeus delayed the approach of the other giants with his lightning. Athena guided the course, and Heracles, though he appeared to be yielding ground, was in truth drawing his enemy toward the line of his end. This pursuit was not a flight born of naked fear, but a fatal design built with cold intelligence. In his rage, Alcyoneus had become too blinded to think about which soil his strength truly belonged to. The change was felt the moment the boundary was crossed. Alcyoneus was still enormous and terrifying, but the tireless weight behind his blows suddenly seemed to weaken. A tiny delay entered his movements, and there was a visible slackening in his shoulders. Heracles saw it at once. First he sent one of his poison-tipped arrows. The wound opened, and for the first time it did not close on its own. Then the hero surged forward, swung his club again, and broke the giant's balance. This time Alcyoneus truly staggered. Zeus's lightning flashed above them as well, sealing the moment. Heracles did not hesitate. He delivered the final strike in the form the old tales told in different ways, and this time Alcyoneus fell to the ground and did not rise again. The silence that settled over the battlefield was heavier even than the giant's fall, because it was not only a giant that had fallen there. For the first time, the belief in the giant's invincibility had been broken. All could see with their own eyes that the prophecy had worked, and that the divine plan had been completed by a mortal hand. Alcyoneus being brought down affected both sides deeply. For the giants, it meant that one of the army's unshakable pillars had been broken. For Olympus, it meant something greater than morale. It was the first proof that the war could truly be won. In this first great duel, Heracles also came to understand his own role completely. He was no longer a condition discussed in council or an abstract clause of prophecy. He had become the living truth of the war. Zeus saw that clearly when he looked at his son. Athena, for her part, felt a cold satisfaction in seeing the plan confirmed. But none of them gave themselves over to triumph, because the fall of Alcyoneus would only drive the other giants into even greater fury. And above all, it would bring forward the army's true leader. And that is exactly what happened. After the body of Alcyoneus had been laid low, a greater shadow began to rise from among the giants, Porphyrion. Alcyoneus's fall did not scatter the army of the giants. On the contrary, it gathered them again under an even fiercer rage. At the center of this new wave stood Porphyrion. He was not merely one of the largest among the giants. He carried within himself the ambition of a king, the hatred of a rebel, and the desire of a ruler reaching toward the heavens. If Alcyoneus had been the symbol of earthbound endurance, Porphyrion was the embodiment of open assault and a claim to power. When he walked across the battlefield, the other giants did not simply gather around him. It was as if they drew their courage from him as well. His body carried the weight of a mountain, and his voice struck with the force of thunder. He did not merely hurl rocks, he rebuilt the army's morale. Zeus and Athena understood very quickly that neutralizing Alcyoneus had shattered the giant's sense of invincibility. But as long as Porphyrion remained standing, the spirit of the army would remain alive. For that reason, the next great confrontation would be harsher and even more symbolic. This time, the gods were facing not just a powerful giant, but a king who carried a claim to the throne of Olympus itself. The most dangerous thing about Porphyrion was not simply his body. Unlike the other giants, he seemed to understand the meaning of the war itself. When he looked at Olympus, he did not see an unreachable home of the gods. He saw a center of power that had to be seized. Because of that, his attacks were not driven by blind fury, but by the desire to overturn the hierarchy itself. In moments when the giants seemed ready to fall back, his roar drove them forward again, and the torn-up boulders and tree trunks under his command became a second line of siege. For Athena, this led to one clear conclusion. Until Porphyrion fell, the center of the war could not be broken. Zeus, however, saw another danger. In the king's eyes, there was not only destruction, but the urge for a humiliating form of dominion. That meant the war had moved beyond being purely military and had become an offense directed at the sacred order itself. From that point on, the Gigantomachy entered a stage that was more personal, darker, and even more destructive. The turning point of that stage came when Porphyrion turned his full attention directly toward Hera. To set his sights on the Queen of Olympus meant more than attacking a goddess. It meant reaching toward Zeus's household, the honor of Olympus, and the sacred center of the celestial order. When Hera was forced to withdraw, Zeus's anger was no longer only the anger of a warrior. What had come under attack there was both his wife and the dignity of his rule. That was exactly why Porphyrion was the most dangerous of all the giants. He did not simply want to win, he wanted to shame the gods and stain their thrones in the process. That was why Zeus did not hesitate. But he did not unleash his lightning in blind rage. He used it with full awareness of the limits set by prophecy. He knew he could not bring the giant down on his own. The lightning only had to open the way to the giant's final defeat. Zeus's lightning tore down through the sky and struck Porphyrion in the chest. The blow was so violent that the giant king's body buckled to his knees, his shoulders convulsed, and the giants around him saw for the first time that their leader had truly staggered. In that moment, a great gap opened on the battlefield, but Zeus did not stop. He hurled a second lightning strike, throwing the king's balance completely apart and forcing him into a fatal opening. Here, the prophecy made itself known once more. The god's blows had opened the door. It would be a mortal hand that would close it. Heracles stepped forward without the slightest hesitation. He set one of his arrows treated with the venom of the Hydra, measured the tiny opening Zeus had created, and released his shot. The arrow struck Porphyrion with decisive force. The giant king tried to gather his full strength once more, but he could no longer find a second power strong enough to keep him standing. Zeus's lightning and Heracles' arrow had joined together. When Porphyrion fell, it was not only a body that collapsed, but the central will of the giant army as well. The effect of his defeat was different from the effect of Alcyoneus's. The first had shattered the idea of invincibility. Porphyrion's fall broke the bond of leadership. The giants were still many, and they were still terrifying, but they could no longer gather around a single will. Each one began to grow more savage, more scattered, and more personal in his fury. Olympus felt that change immediately. The war would move away from a massed siege and turn into a chain of great individual duels and local catastrophes. That did not mean the war was ending. On the contrary, it meant it was becoming more fragmented and more dangerous. But one truth was now unmistakable. The greatest claim to the throne that had risen against Olympus had been brought down. For Hera, that moment meant not only deliverance, but the defense of heaven's honor once again. For Zeus, it confirmed a form of kingship that knew his strength alone was no longer enough, and yet could still rule in alignment with fate. With Porphyrion neutralized, the Gigantomachy entered a new stage. The army had not vanished, but it had lost its head. From that point on, the war had become complex enough that the enraged individual giants, scattered across different regions of the world, would have to be brought down one by one. Athena saw that immediately. The next great answer would have to come from the mind. Because what stood before them now was no longer only brute force, but different forms of disaster itself. And one of those forms had already begun to withdraw toward a new ground: Enceladus. After Porphyrion's fall, the weight of the war broke apart even further across the land, and new threats began to emerge in individual forms. One of the most striking among them was Enceladus. He was not a figure who commanded armies like a king, yet he seemed to carry in his body the spirit of earthquakes, underground pressure, and destruction fused with flight. Wherever he moved, it was not only the rocks that collapsed, the ground itself grew restless. Some giants tried to crush their enemies head-on, and some resisted by drawing strength from the earth, but Enceladus turned movement itself into catastrophe. For that reason, it seemed unlikely that he could be stopped by force alone. That was exactly why Athena stepped forward. What was needed here was not rage, but precision. Throughout the Gigantomachy, the goddess of wisdom had understood that every great enemy carried a different language of death. Enceladus spoke in the language of flight, upheaval, and shifting danger. His end too had to match that nature. Athena's duel did not begin with a showy attack. She watched Enceladus's rhythm. At times the giant rose like a tower. At times he changed direction suddenly with his serpent body, and at times he tore through the ground, leaving fresh fractures in his wake. Athena did not merely deflect these movements. She understood how they worked. No strike delivered before the right moment would be enough. Enceladus's greatest strength was his freedom of movement. He was never most dangerous when he stood still. He became most dangerous while changing position. Once Athena understood that, she shifted the duel from a fixed confrontation into a controlled pursuit. Whenever Enceladus seemed to fall back, she did not chase him with blind ambition. She calculated his direction, watched where he was being driven, and waited for his own freedom to turn into the instrument of his downfall. In the end, the pursuit drifted toward Sicily. There, the language of the land itself would change, and victory would be won not only with a spear, but with the weight of an entire island. On the hard volcanic ground of Sicily, Athena made her final move. As Enceladus continued his retreat, the goddess pinned him at the right point, and with her divine power, brought the mass of an entire island down over him. This was not an ordinary defeat. Enceladus was not simply knocked to the ground, he was sealed beneath Sicily itself. In that way, his catastrophe became chained to the geography of the world. In later ages, people would explain the tremors and underground fire of Sicily as the stirrings of Enceladus beneath it. Athena's victory gained a double meaning here. On one hand, she stopped a giant. On the other, she carved the authority of order into stone and fire. For the first time, the Gigantomachy became an open mythical outcome that reshaped geography itself. But Athena's war did not end there. This time Pallas stood before her, a barer embodiment of savage, excessive, primal force. Pallas did not think. He only tried to crush. He hurled rocks into the sky, pounded the earth, and seemed determined to wipe away everything before him, as though it were the natural right of his size. In this duel, Athena did not use geography as she had against Enceladus. Instead, she used the mind of war itself. Every great assault Pallas launched was, in truth, a movement that opened his own defense. As Athena turned aside his blows, the giant grew more furious and even more scattered. At last, in a charge where he hurled his full weight forward, the goddess saw the opening she had been waiting for and struck with a decisive thrust of her spear. When Pallas fell, a stark lesson became visible on the field of war. Primal force exhausts itself when it stands against intelligence. What Athena did to Pallas made the duel even more symbolic. She did not merely bring about his end, she turned his terrifying power into a part of her own order. Pallas's defeat became a dark sign, showing that what was wild had not only been suppressed by wisdom, but transformed by it. In that way, Athena's front produced two great results. Enceladus had been sealed beneath the earth, and Pallas had been overcome by intelligence. Earth and violence had been defeated in different ways by the hand of wisdom. This showed that the language of Olympus's victory had also changed. The gods were no longer only fighting, they were bringing their enemies to an end in ways that would be carved into the world and into meaning itself. When Athena's front came to a close, another side of the war grew heavier. This time the fury of the giants was shifting toward the seas. One of Gaia's children had turned toward the waters, searching for a new realm instead of accepting defeat. Poseidon was the first to feel it. The seas made it clear to him that a foreign power had begun to slip into their depths. The next reckoning would now be written across the waves. After Porphyrion had been brought down, and Athena had secured her victories on land, one arm of the war shifted toward the seas. At the center of this new front stood Polybotes. He advanced like a disaster, carrying Gaia's wrath into the water. With every coil of his serpent-like lower body, he tore heavily through the waves, and every step he drove into the sea sent massive ruptures crashing along the shores. For Polybotes, turning toward the sea was not a retreat. It was an attempt to spread chaos into another realm. If he managed to take root within the waters, Olympus could lose its order not only on land, but across the seas as well. Poseidon understood this before anyone else did. He was not merely the god who ruled the seas, he was the god who felt their spirit. Because of that, he sensed at once the pressure Polybotes created, the foreign rage moving through the water, and the fear carried in the shifting currents. In that moment, the Gigantomachy was carried fully onto a maritime front for the first time. When Poseidon rose from the foam in the chariot drawn by his white horses, the three-pronged spear in his hand shone not merely like a weapon, but like the law of the seas themselves. The pursuit continued among the islands, along the coastlines, and across the blue yet restless surface of the Aegean. Polybotes tore loose great stones and hurled them back, twisted sharply through the water to change direction, and at times drew close to shore in search of a chance to reclaim the support of the earth. Poseidon, however, used the water itself as a weapon. Waves rose up, deflecting the paths of the rocks that were thrown, while walls of foam broke apart the burning trunks Polybotes cast behind him. This chase was not merely a clash between two powers. Here, the measured order of the sea challenged the dark surge of Gaia's force. If Polybotes could plant himself firmly on land, he might once again draw strength from the deep power of the earth. For that reason, time itself became the unseen enemy on the seafront. Polybotes drawing near the shores of Kos was something Poseidon could not allow. If the giant re-established himself on land, then the sea and land fronts together could produce an even greater catastrophe. It was here that the god made his greatest move. Poseidon raised his spear and tore a massive section of land from the coast of Kos, as though it had been made of nothing more than loose earth. It was one of the most magnificent moments in the entire war. A huge mass of island stone rose into the sky and began to fall over Polybotes like an enormous shadow. With all his power, Poseidon hurled that landmass down upon the giant. Polybotes twisted through the water and tried to escape, but he was no longer facing a single spear strike. He was facing an entire piece of geography. The torn island mass crashed down over him and pinned him to the bottom of the sea. In that way, Poseidon did not merely overcome an enemy, he also brought forth the birth of a new island that would be known as Nisiros. Once again, the Gigantomachy wrote itself onto the map of the world. But even here, the law of the war had not yet been fulfilled. Polybotes had been trapped, yet the condition of the prophecy still remained in force. The gods could seal the giants, stun them, and force them down, but the final judgment still required the hand of a mortal. That was why Heracles entered the scene once more. With the lion's skin over his shoulders, his bow drawn, and his arrow prepared with the fated power that had marked his previous battles, he felt the force still struggling beneath Nisiros. He aimed his arrow not merely at the stone, but at the life straining beneath it. When he released the shot, it was not an ordinary finishing blow, but the last seal that closed, in the name of fate, the opening Poseidon had made. With that strike, Polybotes' life came to its end. The seas withdrew into a heavy silence. Poseidon felt the rhythm of the waters return to his command once more. In that way, the seafront was brought to a close as well. The significance of this victory was immense. For the first time, the war had advanced across sky, land, and sea together, and in each realm, it had been won through a different principle. Zeus had acted through lightning, Athena through intellect, Poseidon through geography and water, and Heracles as the mortal seal that completed the decree. Olympus's way of victory had become layered and many-sided. For Gaia, however, every new loss meant another fresh pain. Her children were being buried beneath the earth, pressed under the sea, or silenced by divine blows completed by mortal arrows. Yet the war had still not ended. The remaining Gigantes, especially in the dark and mist-laden regions of Bathos, were preparing for one last and more desperate stand. Even as the seas grew calm, no god on Olympus felt completely at ease. Because even the end of Polybotes reminded them of one truth. Gaia's children had become dangerous, not only because of their number, but because they drew strength by binding themselves to different elements of nature. Every new victory revealed that yet another realm had already been touched by corruption. Now the war had reached the place that would open its darkest and final phase, Bathos. When the smoke over Bathos cleared, the battlefield carried for the first time the feeling of a true ending. The fallen giant forms, the shattered rocks, the split ground, and the fading divine flames clearly showed how costly the Gigantomachy had been. Olympus had remained standing. Zeus still held his lightning. Athena's mind had untangled the hardest knots of the war. Poseidon had secured the seafront, and Heracles had fulfilled the condition of the prophecy without fail. It all seemed as though it had ended, but it only seemed that way. For Gaia, the last cries that had risen from Bathos were not an ending, but the beginning of a new and darker decision. Her children had fallen one by one, and each of them had been buried, restrained, or silenced by divine blows completed through mortal hands. In Gaia's heart, there was no longer only grief, but a rage great enough to unsettle creation itself. She understood that sending warriors one by one had not been enough. This time not an army, but a living cataclysm had to stand against Olympus. Olympus was in no state to savor its victory, because after Bathos, a strange darkening began in the sky. An uneasy pressure gathered in the depths of the seas, and unexplainable rumblings rose beneath the earth. Athena was among the first to notice it. This overwhelming silence arriving immediately after victory was not natural. Zeus, in much the same way, sensed that something far heavier than the remains of war was approaching. The peace that should have followed the fall of the giants never truly came. It was as if the world had held its breath, waiting for an unseen birth. In some places, the heat beneath the ground began to rise, and the sounds coming from within the caves stopped resembling echoes and began to sound more like muffled breathing. Even Heracles, despite the deep exhaustion in his body, could not shake the feeling that he was standing before a door that had not yet closed. Instead of celebrating this silence, Olympus chose to listen to it. And the longer it listened, the more it believed that the anger beneath the earth had not ended, but had only changed its form. Gaia completed her decision there. The defeat of her children had shown her one thing clearly. Even the giants who had worn Olympus down across separate fronts could eventually be stopped. Then this time, all that anger, all that buried darkness, the cry of the Titans, the hatred of the giants, and the humiliation of motherhood had to be gathered into a single body. She turned her gaze toward Tartarus. It was not only a prison, but the dark womb of the deepest horrors hidden at the bottom of the universe. The union of Gaia and Tartarus did not mean an ordinary birth, but a cosmic rupture. In the caves of Cilicia and in its dusty, ominous lands, this final creation began to take shape. The caves groaned under the pressure rising from within, the mountain lines tightened, and even light itself seemed unwilling to come near that place. At last, Gaia's final hope was born. Typhon. This being was not a child, but a walking catastrophe set against the order of the world. Typhon's appearance carried a terror that surpassed even the dread of the giants. His body rose beyond mountains, and his head reached to the borders of clouds and stars. He bore a false shape that resembled a man as far as his hips, but that resemblance only made the coming savagery more unsettling. Hundreds of dragon heads rose from his shoulders, his hands, and different parts of his body. Each of those heads hissed and roared on its own, yet all of them moved under a single will and lunged at once. From the waist down, he was wrapped in enormous coils of serpents. When he spread his wings, the sky darkened, the wind forgot its direction, and the clouds scattered in alarm. Fire burst from his eyes and scorched whatever it touched, while his hair streamed like poisonous smoke. Typhon was not merely the sum of all Gaia's earlier children, but something beyond them, a being on another scale entirely. He was vast enough to stand in place of an army by himself, and dreadful enough to throw the balance of Olympus into chaos on his own. The moment Typhon was born, he moved into attack, because in his existence there was no such thing as waiting. He hurled burning rocks into the sky. Flames rising from the dragon heads tore through the clouds. The stars lost their course, and the heavens seemed for the first time truly stained. Olympus shook before that horror. The giants had been frightening. Typhon forced most of the gods to flee. Some accounts said that certain deities went as far as Egypt and hid themselves by taking the forms of animals. That alone was enough to convey the scale of their fear, because what stood before them was no longer an army that could be handled through tactics, but a primal catastrophe created to disrupt the cosmos itself. Gaia had given her final answer, and that answer made Olympus tremble as it never had before. With Typhon's rise, Zeus came forward as the one great will that stood against him. He took up his lightning and the ancient adamantine sickle. When he stood before the creature at the highest threshold of the sky, this was no longer merely a war between rulers. It was the final confrontation between order and the return of chaos. The Gigantomachy had been left behind here. Now the true life and death trial of the cosmos was beginning. Bathos had not resembled the battlefields that had come before it. It was not an open plain beneath the sky, where warriors faced one another in full view, but a damp, smoky, heavy borderland close to the underworld. The earth's breath had felt hotter there, the sounds had come through more muffled, and the shadows had stretched longer. The waters around the spring of Olympus had begun to boil, and the steam rising from the ground had spread over the battlefield like a veil from a nightmare. The remaining core of the giants had gathered the last fragment of their hope there. They were no longer an army in the open. They were cornered, but still dangerous, individual forces of disaster. For Olympus, Bathos was not only the site of one final military push, but the place where the last roots of barbarity would be torn away. As Heracles and the gods moved toward the dark passages, everyone felt the same thing. What would end there was not only a war, but the final collective resistance of Gaia's children. In that final phase, the first great duel unfolded between Hermes and Hippolytus. Hermes was normally known as a messenger, a guide, and a crosser of boundaries, but at Bathos he had taken on a far more unsettling role. He had put on Hades' helmet of invisibility. The helmet did not merely conceal him, it turned him into something almost indistinguishable from the night itself. Facing him was Hippolytus, one of the most fearsome of the giants, with his immense frame, his lower body like that of a dragon, and the sheer force to hurl chunks of rock into the air. The smoky terrain of Bathos had been perfect for invisibility. Hippolytus struck at empty air, pounded the ground, and roared out challenges to the enemy he could not see. Hermes, meanwhile, moved around him like a dark shadow, nullifying every attack. At last, when the right moment came, he stepped out of invisibility, landed a decisive blow, and brought the giant down. Yet the prophecy remained unchanged here as well. The one who would silence Hippolytus forever could not be the hand of a god, but the hand of a mortal. Heracles did not hesitate. The pride of Zeus, the god's one mortal ally, stepped forward through the smoke of Bathos. He drew his bow, released his arrow tipped with the deadly venom of the Hydra, and sent it straight into Hippolytus's chest. The giant twisted one final time. His great body struck against the earth, and then he fell still. In that moment, Hermes' invisible cunning and Heracles' fatal precision came together. But the terror at Bathos did not end there. In another corner of the field, a power never before seen in this war stepped onto the stage. The Moirai, the Fates. Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos were normally the silent cosmic powers who spun, measured, and cut the threads of life. But that day they carried not spindles, but enormous bronze maces. Opposite them stood Agrius and Thoas, two of the most stubborn of the giants, known for their brute force and savage endurance. The advance of the Moirai seemed to freeze the battlefield in silence, for here it was no longer the gods who were delivering judgment, but fate itself. Agrius and Thoas resisted with all their size and strength, but before the cold step of destiny, it became clear how empty muscle and bone really were. When the heavy bronze maces came down through the air, those merciless blows did more than crush armor. Each strike seemed to tear at the invisible threads of life from the place where they had been bound. The giants staggered, but even then one final hand was needed to complete their end. Heracles arrived here as well. Driving his fate-sealing arrows into their chests, he extinguished their lives beyond recall. At the same time, on another side of Bathos, Artemis used her silver bow to leave the swift giant Gratian unable to continue, and then Heracles went to make his defeat final. In this way, the war at Bathos shifted completely from one duel after another into a full pattern of destruction. In every corner, a different divine power opened the way, and Heracles closed that way with death. Zeus, meanwhile, sealed all of those clashes from above with his lightning. As each remaining giant fell one by one into the muddy and dark ground of Bathos, the victory of Olympus no longer looked like an abstract hope, but like visible devastation. When the resistance at Bathos was broken, the backbone of the giant's pride was broken forever as well. The last cries echoed through the mountains of Arcadia, reached all the way into Gaia's depths, and deepened the grief of the Earth Mother once again. Yet that last resistance had also been shattered. After Bathos, no military core of the giants remained. On the surface, Olympus had won. And yet the feeling that came out of Bathos was not the joy of triumph. Everyone felt that something very deep and very heavy had ended, while at the same time something even greater had begun to stir beneath the earth. For Gaia was not a being who would remain silent after such devastation. The final resistance of her children had been crushed at Bathos, yes, but the root of motherhood and buried fury still remained in the world. Gigantomachy had ended there in military terms, but the darkness of the story had not yet fully closed. The silence that seemed to have been won by Olympus was already beginning to turn into the heavy breath of a far greater catastrophe. The clash between Zeus and Typhon overshadowed every battle that had come before it. In the war against the giants, there had been armies, duels, and separate fronts. Here, however, the single great defender of order stood face to face with the single vast embodiment of chaos. Every time Zeus hurled his lightning, the sky split with white streaks, and Typhon answered with burning stones, fire pouring from his dragon heads, and masses of dark cloud. In this confrontation, it was not only two beings that were in conflict. The whole universe trembled around them. Mountains shuddered, seas pulled tight, and the gates of the underworld filled with echoing force. When Typhon's hundreds of heads roared at once, even the layers of the sky seemed as if they might break apart. Zeus's lightning drove him back, but it was not enough to fully break him. The creature was as terrifying in his stubbornness as he was in his size. Every wound seemed to make him more savage rather than forcing him to retreat. While the rest of the gods of Olympus tried to gather themselves from a distance, the true weight of the war rested for a time on Zeus's shoulders alone. Zeus quickly understood that he would not be able to bring Typhon down with a single blow. This monster was less something to destroy outright than a disaster that had to be forced down and contained. With his adamant sickle, he moved in at the right moments and struck the creature's body, and with his lightning he kept driving him back. Yet Typhon's serpent coils, dragon heads, and blazing gaze kept pulling the course of the battle back into darkness each time. The struggle moved to Mount Cassius, and from there across other mountain ridges. Typhon was not merely attacking, he was also trying to unravel the order of the heavens. The stars lost their course, the familiar flow of the winds broke apart, and even the rhythm of the seasons was shaken. For Zeus, the matter had gone far beyond defending his throne. If Typhon prevailed, every boundary in the universe would come undone. The distinction between sky, sea, earth, and underworld would collapse, and the defeat of Olympus would become the collapse of the cosmos itself. That thought hardened Zeus's resolve. He had become not merely a god, but the last wall holding all order in place. Over time, the other powers of Olympus overcame their fear and began gathering once more around Zeus. Athena's wisdom, Hermes' quickness, and the returning courage of the other divine beings kept the ruler of the heavens from standing completely alone. Even so, the final judgment would still be delivered by Zeus's own hands. The goal was not simply to eliminate Typhon, but to imprison him beneath a weight from which he could never return. The great lesson learned throughout the Gigantomachy was applied here one final time. Enceladus had been forced down beneath an island, and Polybotes had been sealed beneath a mass of land that rose in the middle of the sea. Typhon required a similar end, but on a far greater scale. Zeus drove the monster step by step westward, toward the fiery and volcanic regions of Sicily. The world itself seemed to sense that movement in advance. Mountain ridges groaned, underground fires grew restless, and the air became heavier. The greatest monster of creation was being forced toward the underside of one of creation's heaviest mountains. The last great turning point came near Etna. Zeus gathered all of his lightning and poured the white fury of the heavens down upon Typhon. The monster answered with flame, smoke, and hundreds of heads, twisting wildly. But the reckless confidence of his first rise was no longer there. Zeus was wearing him down, cutting off his direction and narrowing every path by which he might withdraw. At last, the right moment came. With divine force, Zeus brought Typhon down and forced him beneath the terrible weight of Etna. That scene became the most cosmic and most final moment of the entire epic. A vast mountain of the earth became the grave of the most dreadful body in the universe. As Typhon was buried, his dragon heads gave one last cry. His serpent coils twisted, as if they might tear open the earth, and the fire from his eyes surged upward like one final outburst of rage. But the result did not change. Zeus did not simply strike chaos down. He chained it into the depths of the world. From that moment on, Etna was no longer only a mountain. It became the place where order had forced chaos beneath its weight. Yet that victory did not bring a perfect silence. Even if a being like Typhon had been fully overcome, his fury remained written into the depths of the earth. This was where the mythic meaning of earthquakes and volcanoes began. The flames, smoke, and eruptions rising from within Etna came to be understood as the suppressed breaths of Typhon. The pressure inside the mountain was seen as his body still struggling beneath the weight above it. In the same way, tremors in different parts of the world were understood as echoes of the buried but not entirely silenced fury of Gaia's children, and especially of Typhon. In this way, the Gigantomachy and the war against Typhon ceased to be only a great conflict that had happened in the distant past. They became the living memory of the world itself. Every earthquake and every volcanic eruption caused people to remember the buried catastrophes once again. Zeus's victory, then, was not only the victory of a ruler protecting his throne, it was also the moment when order learned how fragile it truly was, even as it overcame chaos. The complacency that had followed the Titanomachy was gone. Olympus now understood that whatever was forced down could one day return in another form. For Athena, this was the highest confirmation of intellect and patience in the face of catastrophe. For Poseidon, it was the preservation of the law of the seas. For Heracles, it was proof that mortal courage could touch the fate of the cosmos itself. Olympus had not been enough on its own, yet when it stood joined with the mortal hand, it endured. That made one of the epic's greatest lessons unmistakably clear. Even the greatest orders sometimes needed the very forces they believed stood outside them. And so the story was complete. From the stony plains of Phlegra to the steaming darkness of Bathos, from the breath beneath Sicily to the new islands born in the Aegean, the world began carrying the marks of that great war. Gaia was defeated, but she was not forgotten. Her children were forced down, but their voices remained within the earth. Zeus had won, but he had learned the cost of victory and the fragility that came with it. And for ages afterward, whenever people saw a mountain erupt, felt the earth shake without warning, or watched the sea turn violent for no clear reason, they remembered not only nature, but a far older truth. Nothing that had been forced down remained silent forever. Order could endure only if it remembered that. With Typhon forced beneath Mount Etna, the sky had opened once more. The stars had returned to their proper paths, and the pillars of Olympus had stood firm again. In time, the seas had regained their old rhythm. The broken mountain roads had fallen silent. The smoke of Bathos had cleared, and the cries that had once echoed across the stony plains of Phlegra had sunk deep into memory. From the outside, it had seemed as though everything had truly come to an end. The gods had remained on their thrones. Gaia's children had either been cut off from the world or sealed into the world's deepest places, and the cosmos had returned to order. But the true legacy of that great war had not rested only in who had won, but in what had been left behind. For after the Gigantomachy, the world had no longer been an innocent world. Every mountain had seemed a little heavier, every sea a little deeper, every volcano a little more meaningful. Whenever the earth trembled, people would remember that it was not only stone that was shifting, but also an old, buried fury still turning beneath the ground. Olympus had won its victory, but that victory had not been the kind of comfort that could be preserved by forgetting. It had been a fragile balance, one that had to be remembered again with every tremor. That was why the old storytellers had not told this tale merely to praise the power of the gods. They had also wanted to remind people that no matter how brilliant order appeared, it always carried some buried darkness beneath it. Uranus had feared his children, Cronus had swallowed his own offspring, and Zeus had chained his enemies in Tartarus. Every age had built its own order, but each one had also buried its own fear in that order's foundation. Gaia's anger had risen from exactly that place, because whatever was pushed down, even when it seemed forgotten, could one day return wearing another face. The Titans had gone, the giants had come, the giants had fallen, and Typhon had risen. The shape of the war had changed, but its deepest truth had not. When power joined itself to fear, it seemed to create order, yet at the same time it planted the seeds of its own future disaster in the earth. That was why the Gigantomachy was not only a war between gods and giants. It was the great question every age had to ask itself. Had an order truly been built on justice, or had it remained standing only so long as it could suppress what threatened it? When that question was left unanswered, the earth below would one day speak again. Another lesson had been hidden in the presence of Heracles. The immortal gods of Olympus, for all their strength, had not been able to bring that war to its end on their own. The requirement of the prophecy had not been a mere technical detail. It had been one of the deepest truths of the myth. Sometimes order was not preserved by power descending from above alone. Sometimes it also required courage rising from below, a will that understood pain, and a heart willing to step beyond mortal limits. That was why Heracles' role in the war had been so great. He had not only been the warrior who brought the giants to their end, he had been the figure who made visible the invisible bond between gods and humankind. It made us think of this. Even in the greatest crises, salvation sometimes came not only from the strongest, but from the one willing to accept responsibility. Immortality might have granted power, but it did not teach the cost of endurance. Yet some doors could be closed only by hands that knew suffering. The weight Heracles carried in the story did not reveal the smallness of what was human. On the contrary, it showed that a human being, by accepting the right responsibility at the right moment, could touch even the fate of the universe. Perhaps that was why not only the gods, but mortals as well, had to be counted among the true inheritors of this epic. And in the end, the heaviest thought remained. Had Gaia truly been defeated? Her children had fallen, her anger had been driven down, and even her last hope, Typhon, had been sealed beneath Athena. And yet, as long as the world itself continued to live, Gaia had continued to live with it. For she had not been only a mother who had waged war, she had been the earth itself, weight itself, patience itself, and the gathering force of long-held sorrow. That was why her story told us that the most dangerous form of hostility was not the anger that shouted openly, but the grievance that went unheard for a long time. Human beings, societies, and powers alike often imagined that great destruction came in sudden eruptions. Yet the greatest catastrophes usually grew inside cracks, that remained unseen for far too long. Ignoring a mother's grief, belittling a people's anger, believing that what had been pushed down would remain silent forever. All of these could one day return like the splitting of the earth itself. So the true warning of this epic was this: order could endure not simply because it was strong, but only so long as it remained just. Otherwise, whatever was buried today would become the seed of a new giant, a new Typhon, or a new disaster tomorrow. The breath beneath Etna still seemed to whisper that truth. Across the ages, when people had seen a mountain erupt, the earth suddenly shake, or the sea surge with an unexplained fury, they had not only felt fear, they had also thought deeply. For the true power of myth lay not only in explaining what happened, but in making people sense a deeper meaning beneath what could be seen. The Gigantomachy was that kind of story. It did not tell us only that the gods had won. It also told us the cost of power, the cycle of fear, the return of buried pain, and how dangerously fragile any order could be when it stood without justice beneath it. That was why the story should not have ended with Typhon writhing beneath Etna, but within the person listening to it. The one who heard this story had to ask themselves this question: what were the orders I had built in my own life standing on, justice or only buried silences? If the answer was the second, then even the strongest looking lives might one day begin to crack from below. Perhaps the truest lesson of this epic lay there. To overcome chaos was not to bury it, but to understand the blindness that had created it and refuse to build the same cycle again. Otherwise, every victory would become only the quiet beginning of the next disaster. I hope that as you end your day, this ancient epic has been a good story for you. I look forward to your comments and requests. Do not forget to follow my channel. May the darkness of the night and the rhythm of the sea bring you peace. Until we meet again in another legend, in the breath of another hero, love.